Chernobyl did not end in 1986. The explosion that tore through Reactor No. 4 was only the beginning. What followed was not simply contamination, evacuation, and containment. It was a slow-moving political, economic, and psychological rupture that extended far beyond the borders of Ukraine. The disaster unfolded in layers: technical, human, institutional, and geopolitical. In the months after the explosion, Soviet authorities focused on immediate stabilization. The fire had been extinguished. The core had been buried beneath sand, boron, lead, and concrete. Helicopters no longer hovered endlessly above the glowing crater. But beneath the surface, another crisis was forming, one far more difficult to contain. The economic burden of Chernobyl was staggering. Entire agricultural regions in Ukraine and Belarus were declared unsafe. Villages were abandoned permanently. Thousands of homes required compensation. Workers demanded hazard pay. Hospitals required new equipment. Monitoring stations had to be installed across vast territories. Decontamination operations continued for years. Soil was scraped. Forests were buried. Vehicles were destroyed. The Soviet Union was already under strain. Oil prices had fallen sharply in the mid-1980s. Industrial productivity was declining. The centralized command economy struggled to adapt to technological complexity. Chernobyl did not create these weaknesses, but it amplified them. Estimates of the total cost vary widely. Some calculations suggest the disaster consumed a significant percentage of the Soviet annual budget over several years. Billions of rubles were redirected toward containment and compensation. Resources that might have supported modernization or reform were instead absorbed by damage control. But the financial toll was only part of the story. Trust, the invisible currency of governance, began to erode. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, the Soviet Union delayed public acknowledgement. Local officials hesitated. Moscow hesitated. The scale of the accident was unclear, and the instinct to control information was deeply embedded within the system. For decades, secrecy had been considered a strength. Information flowed vertically, not horizontally. Crisis communication was filtered, delayed, managed. That instinct proved catastrophic. When radiation alarms triggered at a nuclear facility in Sweden, international attention forced the Soviet government to admit that an accident had occurred. The outside world learned of Chernobyl before many Soviet citizens did. And once the truth began to emerge, it could not be fully contained. Under Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of Perestroika and Glasnost, reform had already begun tentatively. But Chernobyl accelerated the process. The disaster made secrecy politically dangerous. Newspapers demanded transparency. Scientists requested the freedom to speak openly. Citizens asked questions. Why had they not been warned immediately? Why had parades proceeded in contaminated cities? Why had children continued attending school under radioactive fallout? The state's response was cautious but transformative. Investigative journalism expanded. Technical details about reactor design flaws were gradually released. Public debate intensified. Chernobyl became more than an accident. It became a symbol of systemic opacity. In 1987, plant officials faced trial. The proceedings were highly publicized. Prosecutors emphasized operator errors, deviation from safety protocol, poor judgment, violations of procedure. The narrative presented was one of individual responsibility. Yet behind that narrative lay a more complex truth. Engineers and physicists debated the RBMK reactor design, the positive void coefficient, the graphite-tipped control rods, the lack of containment structure comparable to Western reactors, design vulnerabilities that had been known but minimized. Was a disaster caused by reckless operators? or by a flawed system that prioritized output over caution. Responsibility could not be isolated to a single layer. The trial delivered sentences, but it did not resolve the deeper institutional questions. Meanwhile, the health consequences of Chernobyl began to surface. Radioactive iodine had spread across wide regions. Children, particularly those who consumed contaminated milk, absorbed significant doses. In the years that followed, thyroid cancer rates rose dramatically among exposed populations. Hospitals in Belarus and Ukraine reported unprecedented cases. Scientists debated the broader cancer impact. Some international studies projected thousands of excess cases over decades. Others urged caution in attributing every illness to radiation exposure. Epidemiology is complex. Causation is rarely simple. But beyond statistics, there was fear. Communities lived with uncertainty. Parents worried about invisible contamination. Anxiety became pervasive. Psychological trauma spread through relocated families who had lost homes, identity, and stability. The social consequences of displacement were profound. Chernobyl was not only a radiological event, it was a psychological rupture. Entire communities were uprooted permanently. The city of Pripyat, once home to nearly 50,000 people, became a frozen landscape. Apartments left intact, toys scattered, Ferris wheels motionless. The Exclusion Zone, a 30-kilometer radius around the reactor, became one of the most restricted areas on Earth. Human habitation ceased. Military checkpoints enforced boundaries. And yet, paradoxically, nature returned. Without agriculture, without industry, without human presence, wildlife populations increased. Forests expanded. Wolves, boar, and birds thrived in areas once densely populated. But this ecological resurgence was not a restoration. Radiation remained embedded in soil, water, and vegetation. Some isotopes would decay within years. Others would persist for centuries. Containment did not mean resolution. In 1986, a massive concrete structure, often called a sarcophagus, was constructed around Reactor No. 4. Built under extreme conditions, it was never intended as a permanent solution. Cracks appeared over time. Structural instability became a concern. Decades later, an even larger steel arch, the new Safe Confinement, was engineered and slid into place. A multinational effort, a symbol of long-term responsibility. Chernobyl became an international project. Globally, the disaster reshaped nuclear policy. Western reactors were reviewed, safety standards strengthened, emergency response protocols revised, international reporting mechanisms improved. Some countries paused nuclear expansion. Others continue but under stricter regulatory frameworks. Public opinion shifted dramatically. Nuclear power, once associated primarily with progress, now carried an enduring shadow. Chernobyl entered the collective consciousness. It influenced energy debates, environmental movements, anti-nuclear activism. It also altered geopolitics. The Soviet Union continued to weaken throughout the late 1980s. Economic stagnation deepened. Political reform generated unintended consequences. Nationalist movements gained momentum across republics. Historians differ on how heavily Chernobyl weighed in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, but many agree that it accelerated processes already underway. The disaster drained resources. It exposed institutional fragility. It damaged credibility domestically and internationally. Perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that technological control was not absolute. The Soviet state had long projected mastery over industry, over science, over nature itself. Chernobyl contradicted that narrative in a single night. The collapse of the Soviet Union cannot be reduced to a reactor explosion. Yet the psychological blow was profound. Gorbachev himself later remarked that Chernobyl may have been the real cause of the Soviet Union's dissolution, more so than Perestroika. Whether that assessment is fully accurate remains debated, but the symbolic weight of Chernobyl is undeniable. It represents the limits of centralized authority in managing complex technological systems. It represents the cost of delayed transparency. It represents the fragility of public trust. More than 3 decades later, the site remains monitored. Tourists visit the Exclusion Zone under controlled conditions. Researchers study wildlife adaptation. Engineers continue evaluating structural stability. Chernobyl is no longer an active emergency, but it is not history in the conventional sense. It is a living legacy. Every nuclear facility worldwide operates with Chernobyl in its shadow. Every reactor design review considers lessons learned from April 26, 1986. Every crisis communication manual references failures observed during those first critical days. Chernobyl teaches that disasters are rarely singular moments. They unfold across systems, across institutions, across generations. A safety test became an explosion became a cover-up became political reform. Reform became destabilization. Destabilization contributed to collapse. The chain reaction extended far beyond physics. Chernobyl remains a warning, not against technology itself, but against complacency, secrecy, and overconfidence. It reminds us that power demands humility, that progress requires transparency, and that the consequences of failure rarely remain confined to their origin. The reactor has been sealed. The city remains empty, but the story continues. And perhaps that is Chernobyl's final lesson. The most enduring fallout is not radioactive. It is institutional. It is political. It is human.